Jack the Ripper was far from the first serial killer. However, until this maniac attacked, his case was the first to cause an international media frenzy. Even more than a century later, everyone knows his moniker, and the mystery behind his attacks is still being investigated. The million-dollar question is, who was Jack the Ripper? We're sorry, but we can't offer you the big revelation you were hoping for by clicking on this video. No one knows for sure. However, we may look at his background and the most plausible suspects. You may speculate as much as you want about who it was, but don't expect a definitive response from anybody. The profile of a killer. If you don't know who Jack the Ripper was, he was an unnamed serial killer who terrorized London in 1888. The victims, all of whom were women, were mutilated or dismembered as part of his signature. Authorities concluded that he was most likely a man looking for easy prey because he tended to solely target inebriated prostitutes. As they pieced the puzzle together, they deduced that he was either mistreated or abandoned by his mother as a youngster. It was most probable for this reason why he solely killed women. There are a few other things we may deduce based on the timing of the killings. The murders were almost always committed on weekends, and only between the hours of 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. These data imply two things. He was presumably employed, but he was unmarried and had no familial connections. How the cases tied together. There was already a high level of violence against women in the neighborhood at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. The East End of London was regarded as the slums at the time. A huge number of attacks and killings took place in the impoverished neighborhood of Whitechapel. Between April 1888 and February 1891, there were 11 murders. They were all carried out in appalling ways, but 5 of them in particular were able to be linked. The canonical 5 ladies of Jack the Ripper are these 5 women. Any further victims are only conjecture that cannot be substantiated. The other 5 ladies were accused of being involved in gang violence. Similarly, no one was ever apprehended for these killings, thus it's hard to rule out Jack the Ripper. The canonical 5, on the other hand, had one thing in common. They were all slain by having their throats sliced. Other horrific wounds and mutilations were inflicted on 4 of them. However, the other had only one laceration, and it is thought that the Ripper was stopped before he could do any more heinous acts. Even though these 5 had a link, it's impossible to say whether or not Jack had more victims. The search for a maniac. Over 2,000 persons were interviewed, 300 were probed, and 80 were imprisoned during the investigation. The perpetrator possessed understanding of human anatomy, indicating that he may be a butcher or work in the medical sector, based on the lacerations on the victims. As a consequence, 76 butchers and slaughterers were visited, and all personnel were examined over the previous 6 months. The case was not formally concluded until 1892, when the authorities declared it closed due to a lack of evidence and success. The unusual suspects. Over 100 theories exist today about Jack the Ripper's actual identity. Ripperologists are those who research Jack the Ripper. Their possibilities include Winston Churchill's father, Lewis Carroll, the creator of Alice in Wonderland, and Queen Victoria's grandson. Some people believe Jack the Ripper was actually Jill the Ripper. In 1890, a woman named Mary Piercy was apprehended and killed for killing her lover's wife and kid in a manner identical to Jack the Ripper. Unfortunately, none of these hypotheses can be proven because there isn't enough forensic evidence concerning the case. We can, however, limit it down to the top 5 most likely candidates. Was it Montague John Druitt? Let's begin with the first bachelor. Montague John Druitt was found guilty despite the lack of scientific or tangible proof, yet the timeline of his life is strikingly similar. Druitt resided within a few miles from the Whitechapel murder scene, and he was said to have been observed in the neighborhood at the same time as the Jack the Ripper killings. Despite the fact that he was a well-educated Oxford graduate, many felt he was sexually deranged, which may have played a role in the women's mutilations. The fact that Druitt's body was discovered approximately 7 weeks after the likely last victim of Jack the Ripper is the most compelling reason to believe it was him. His death was deemed a suicide when he was discovered at the bottom of the River Thames. Is it conceivable that Montague went mad and murdered himself after his last strike? Was it Carl Feigenbaum? While analysts assumed Jack was in his late 20s to early 30s, the next candidate is an outlier. Carl. a 54-year-old German sailor, was photographed working near Whitechapel on each of the 5 key murder nights. He was frequently seen at adjacent brothels when anchored in the region, adding to the idea. Worse, he was suspected of being a sociopath who admitted to mutilating women. Even his own lawyer believed he was dealing with Jack the Ripper. Carl went to America in 1890, when he was convicted of murdering a lady and sentenced to death by electric chair. Many noteworthy likenesses to the Jack the Ripper murders and Carl's victims are said to exist in the United States, according to ripperologists. Was it Francis Craig? Many people have recently come to assume that Jack the Ripper was the spouse of one of the victims. Francis Craig was a reporter in the East End at the time of the killings, covering the police courts and investigations into crimes. Some have speculated that Craig suffered from a personality illness, such as schizotypal personality disorder. He just resided a few minutes away from Jack the Ripper's first murder location, giving him the ease of killing in his own neighborhood. Craig married Elizabeth Davies, who is said to have used the identity Mary Jane Kelly, the last victim of Jack the Ripper, as a prostitute. According to sleuths, when Craig learned that his wife was a prostitute, he began plotting her murder. He merely killed the 4 other ladies to hide his involvement in the crime. Was it Walter Sickert? Walter Sickert was well known for his depictions of prostitutes. Some speculate that he would include hints and symbolism concerning the Jack the Ripper murders in his artwork. Professionals argue that the resemblances are so close to genuine crime scenes that they could only have been painted by the real perpetrator. While there is less proof against him than some of the other charges, the parallels between his artwork and the other accusations are too close to ignore. Was it Aaron Kosminski? Many well-respected police officials believe that Aaron Kosminski, a Polish barber, is the Jack the Ripper. Kosminski was born in Russia and migrated to London in the early 1880s, working as a hairdresser in Whitechapel at the time of the killings. In reality, he was known to be sexist and murderous, and was sent to a mental institution in 1889. Aaron was one of the few main suspects in the killings. Even though a witness said he was the one who attacked one of the victims, they declined to testify. Because there was never any hard proof, it was difficult to make an arrest. A shawl recovered at the crime site of one of the victims, Catherine Eddowes, has consistently linked Aaron to the crimes. The shawl was first considered to be Catherine's since it was covered with blood. However, according to one scholar, the quality was too high to have been owned and worn by a prostitute in London at the time. It's possible that the scarf belongs to Jack the Ripper. The cloth was then discovered to be produced in Russia. It was under Russian administration during Kosminski's stay in Poland, and it was common for Russian commodities to be traded there. Aaron's mitochondrial DNA was also discovered on the shawl. However, this doesn't help prove anything because this sort of DNA is likely to match the DNA of many other persons. So who done it? Who do you think is the most probable suspect, based on the evidence above? Personally, I find it impossible to believe that Druitt committed himself shortly after the last victim, but with all the evidence against the other men, it's tough to say. The Ripper is thought to have ceased after the final killing owing to death, jail, exile, or hospitalization. Although we will almost certainly never have a definite solution to this topic, it remains intriguing to investigate. Jack the Ripper, whatever he was, is long dead, and only he will ever know the whole truth.